So for 2019, I'm going to get my Goodreads goal and my YouTube going on strong. I started a little bit last year making a couple of videos, but this year I want to do a whole lot more. Last year, of course, school, life demands got in the way, started a new job, but at the same time, this is why I'm making this one, in particular one in my car, because before I go home, before I deal with the kids, before I deal with homework, I'm going to knock this video out and then I'll edit it later. But I'm doing it right here in my car where it's quiet. So, with that said, I was still reading last year. Let's do a wrap-up of 2018. So, for Goodreads, I read 53 books, and probably about half of those were on Audible while I'm going to and from work, and then out of the other remaining 20-something, probably half of those were on Kindle, and then another half of those would have been physical books because I read sort of a mix of those. So I read 53 books total, and I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the best books I read, some of the worst books I read, and some of the books that made it to work. I keep a little work stand of books that I'll recommend every now and then that people can just take. So let's go with that first. So on my work stand, I have these books. Principles, Political Risk, Dope Sick, and Outliers. And Principles, I talked about that in an earlier video. That one was a long read, but it was interesting about Ray Diallo's sort of work and life principles. It was fairly good. It was just a long read. Political Risk, this was with Condoleezza Rice and another author. That one was, it was really interesting to me as far as when people are in business, sometimes they don't factor in everything. And you can tell that because there's failed businesses. Obviously, they didn't take something into account. And that, you can see that with internet. There were some clothing companies, some retail companies that saw the internet coming, or like Kodak, they saw digital cameras, they made the first digital camera, but then they said, you know what, this is going to be a big thing, we're not going to invest anything into this, and they're gone. Well, Political Risk talks about the risks that companies have that they don't even realize. Specifically, they talked about, what was it, SeaWorld, where, they had so much in the killer whales and everything, and they thought they diversified in other things, but they really didn't. They were so counting on killer whales. So when one little movie, when that Blackfish movie came out, it tanked their business. So they're still trying to recover from that. Another one that I just wrapped up recently was Dope Sick. And that was just talking about the opioid crisis. And I've heard about the opioid crisis, saw stuff in the news, but I didn't realize how quick it spread as far as with oxycodone and different medications, how quick in maybe 20 years that it's changed as far as where they were prescribing it. I remember going for root canals and stuff and getting oxycodone, and it was just kind of a free-for-all or anything. I never got addicted, thankfully, but before there was a different attitude towards, okay, well, if you're in pain, we got to get you out of pain. We'll prescribe you whatever medication you need. And Dope Sick really told the stories of individual people and followed them through, and then, a lot of them didn't make it. A lot of them succumbed to the addiction. So that was really interesting. Last but not least on my work stand, well, there's books from this year, but Outliers. Outliers came out about 10 years ago from Malcolm Gladwell, and he just talks about the story that sometimes people see success, but they don't see all that was involved. So they assume somebody was lucky because they made a team. But he talks about even birth month, how that led that person to get more practice, and he really goes over it step by step. Now, there's a long plane crash sequence in there where he talks about that sequence of events. And I know some reviewers were a little concerned about that because they weren't into planes, and that made it feel like a longer book for them. But for me, since I'm into aviation anyway, that was helpful too. So I like that too. So that was also an interesting read. I ended up buying more of his books just so I could read those, and I plan on reading a couple of those every year if I can. He's an author where I really want to follow and read all of his books I can. Other best books that I don't have on my work stand, but they were just great books. Another author that I want to follow is Ron Chernow. And a lot of people are familiar with him from Alexander Hamilton, his big biography on that. And a lot of people know the play that came out afterwards. And a lot of people followed his work on Alexander Hamilton. Now, Ron Chernow, his biographies are really super detailed, super long. So I plan on reading one of those per year if I can. I have one right now on Washington. I have another one on President Grant that I want to read. So maybe one per year, maybe two per year if I'm doing real good. But it was really, really detailed. Gives you some context of when the person lived, because a lot of times we'll judge a person based on what we know now 200 years later. So Alexander Hamilton and I, of course, 200 years ago was a different climate in this country and everything. But when you look at everything from the lens that he may have been looking at it, where he grew up and the timing that he was growing up and what he could do in his sort of sphere of influence, then maybe that takes it takes things differently than when you look at it that way. There's people that wanted to do certain things 200 years ago. There's people that want to do stuff now, but they're not in total control of the entire country. They're not in control of the entire world, so they affect the influence as best as they can. And the other just unimaginable crazy part about that is they still did duels back in those days, and to think about the sitting vice president killing the Treasury Secretary in a duel. I mean, who could ever imagine something like that happening? Well, let's not get started. Anyway, another great book that I read was Economic Facts and Fallacies by Thomas Sowell. He's another one that I want to follow as far as every year. I want to read at least one or two of his works just because there's so many points that he brings up. And I would say even if you're not a conservative person, even if you don't follow his belief system, he's a good person to at least challenge your thoughts on things. And as far as economics, he talks about a lot of the consequences of decisions when it comes to housing, when it comes to policies that sound good. And that's one of my concerns when I said this channel would bring up politics. There's a lot of policies that sound great. Universal this or this for all or that for all, but it doesn't take into account other things. I'm just going to throw out an example. A ton more people play the lottery when it's $300 million or $600 million or one of those crazy numbers. Now, if you put in like a 90% tax rate, they always talk about, the super rich need to pay more. Okay, fine. So let's say you put in a 90% tax rate, and now that $300 million instead, you're going to take 90% of that away right away. They already take half, but now let's say you're going to take 90% away because, hey, they don't need it or whatever the case is. That could be fine, but at the same time, are less people going to play the lotto then in that case? I know I wouldn't rush out to play it, even though, that amount of money would still completely change my life. I mean, $30 million would still completely change my life, but if you already know they're going to take 90% of it or whatever the case is, it may make you less likely to rush out there. Same with entertainers. So they'll talk about the corporate CEO that makes a ton of money, but what about the entertainer or the basketball player or whatever that brings in a ton of fans? They bring in millions of dollars or whatever. You may say that, hey, I don't watch this stuff. They don't deserve that type of money. But to me, and what Thomas Sowell just talks about is the different effects that the government intervening and saying that this or that is not going to happen. Some people think that'll automatically go in the government's coffers and be redistributed. Well, that's not always what will happen, and he just proves it through his work. So another favorite, and kind of moving off the political sphere, another favorite is Kevin Hart. I mentioned that in another video. I can't make this up. His sort of biography up to that time. Now he's had a lot more recently going on with the Oscars, and I'm sure he'll talk about that at some point later. But his biography, I can't make this up. He told a lot about his personal relationships. He told a lot about the work that he did, the constant comedy clubs that he was going to. You know, it wasn't like he was just famous one day. He worked and worked and worked and got told no, no, no until he made it. So that's another impactful story, because it shows that this person was lucky, yes, but they also worked really, really hard. And they also, you know, it's a combination of luck, skill, and revising over and over and over. And he wasn't even always going by his name. He was like going by some other crazy name or something like that. So I really like those stories that really tell somebody's history. As far as my favorite fiction book, I don't read a whole lot of fiction. I read 2 Stephen King books, at least. I read The Long Walk, which was under his other pen name, Richard Bachman. And then I read The Outsider, which came out last year. The Outsider was great. I mean, Long Walk was good too, but for a Stephen King thing, I did The Outsider as an Audible, and I mean, even walking the dog at night while listening to The Outsider, it was interesting. I liked it. Don't want to give away the ending. You know, Stephen King always has some weird endings there. Now, as far as the worst book that I read, the worst book, and it just took me a long time to get through, was Titanic: First Accounts. The interesting part was that it was written by people who survived the Titanic. So it was written by people that were actually on it, and they were talking about all their accounts. But of course, we know the story, and just the sad part was over and over and over. It was constant. You know, I got on this lifeboat and I watched this person drown. I got on this lifeboat and I watched these other people stay on the ship and drown. And we couldn't pick up these other people because of XYZ. Our lifeboat was full. This person died on the lifeboat. So it was a really, really sad story, which I knew it was going to be sad, but it was constant telling of screaming and drowning, and it was a little tough to even keep up with. I mean, honestly, I could probably read 3 books in the span that it took me to read this book. And they went over the Senate inquiries, and it's interesting to think about, even in this world of social media that we have and technology, they didn't have any of that stuff. So even once they got rescued, all they had to do was exchange papers and stories and pretty much talk about the incident. I think nowadays people would have been probably video chatting with somebody, you know, off of the rescue ship, or doing who knows what, or making vlogs or something like that. But it was interesting, but very, very sad, and it's sort of a tougher read, just because of all that. So that wraps up my 2018 Goodreads for 2019. Like I said, I want to read some Ron Chernow. I want to read some more Malcolm Gladwell, and I got a couple of other authors in there, more Thomas Sowell. And then I'm looking forward to see what other books come out. I have a Bruce Lee book as well that just came out, a biography that's on my list. I actually reduced my Goodreads goal to 40 because I want to read some longer books this time. I have a Max Hastings Vietnam book that's probably 700 pages that I want to get into. So reduced it to 40, looking at some longer reads, and we'll go from there. And I'm going to continue trying to do this maybe in my car, and see how this one works out. And I look forward to seeing all y'all soon. Thank you.